Right, I'm really delighted that Sarah Holland from the University of Nottingham is able to speak to us about assessment and feedback. Sarah's an assistant professor of history. I'm sorry, I had all this on my screen, but I can't now see it. Um, Assistant professor of history at the University of Nottingham, and she's also the education officer for History UK. So she's involved in lots of these discussions around teaching and learning across higher education in the UK, in history in particular. So I'll hand over to Sarah and just let me know when you need me to do any clicking or stuff.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be a part of this event. And I've been here all morning and some of the sessions yesterday. And there's been some fascinating insights. And I think it's just a reminder of how important and how effective discussing our pedagogical practice is in terms of developing our practice and establishing communities of practice. And it's certainly something I wish I'd had the opportunity to participate in when I was new to teaching. And I'm hoping we can facilitate and consolidate some of the ideas that have been coming across from all those different sessions when we think about assessment and feedback. And it's a particular pleasure to be here discussing assessment and feedback because it's something that's so important and integral to teaching and learning. And yet something that's perhaps not always central to our conversations and planning around teaching. And it's something I'm very passionate about. I've been working in higher education for over 10 years and in a different institution or contexts as well. So that includes currently at the University of Nottingham, so a Russell Group, but post-92 university for many, many years. And these varied teaching and learning experiences were very influential and have been influential in terms of shaping my practice, which has included introducing innovative assessments, and stimulating sector-specific conversations about the purpose of assessment in history. And it was early on in my teaching career that I began to think about assessment and had some opportunities to contribute to the design of varying assessment activities. So the aim of this session really is to hopefully demystify elements of the assessment process, to explore opportunities to engage with assessment when you've got different levels of autonomy in your teaching, including being a seminar teacher right the way through. And that includes decoupling assessment and grading and not always thinking of it as an end product, and seeing assessment as a process rather than simply an end product. So on the next slide, we've got an overview of the session just to give you a direct, where we're going in this presentation. To start thinking about what is assessment? What is it? What does it look like? What's the purpose of that assessment? And do we need to start rethinking it in history, or is there a need to rethink it? Then we'll start to think about types of different assessments, but also what makes those different types of assessments effective in different contexts as well. As part of that, I'm also going to talk a little bit from my own practice around creative or alternative assessments. Then we'll think a little bit about designing assessment activities and the agency we have in that, and thinking also about developing students' assessment literacy as well. And then we'll think about feedback around that assessment as well. And there'll be several interactive elements throughout all of this as well. So on the next slide, please, we're going to start by thinking about what assessment is. We all know that assessment is a fundamental part of any degree. It plays a pivotal role in the transitions to university as well. And students and staff spend a large amount of their time focused around aspects of assessment, whether it's doing that assessment, marking that assessment, providing feedback on it. But there aren't always opportunities to take a step back and ask these three questions. What is assessment? What is the purpose of that assessment? And how can we make it more effective and meaningful as a process? And do we need to actually rethink assessment in history specifically? Assessment can, of course, take many different forms, and we'll talk about the specific examples later in the session. But assessment categories include things like formative assessment and summative assessment, formal and informal assessments, so not just the things that are going to be graded, but other things as well. The role of self-assessment and peer assessment, portfolio assessments, individual and group assessments, synoptic assessments that bring everything together. So there's a lot in there. That means we can start to categorize and think about those as different types of assessments that aren't all about an end product, they're about a process. When we think about the purpose of assessment, there's that kind of, it's measuring learning, it's assessment of learning, it's about standards, achievements and qualifications. And to a certain extent it does that. But more and more people have increasingly over the years been talking about it promoting learning. It's assessment for learning, or even assessment as learning, a process that isn't just aligned to the teaching and learning outcomes, but is embedded as part of that process of teaching and learning, that puts the students at the centre of that learning process and at the centre of their assessment, and can give both staff and students greater autonomy in that process whilst maintaining academic standards. And I've got some diagrams on the transitions there, 3 of those to come up, that sort of link the practice with the theory. So the idea that within teaching and learning, Bloom's taxonomy is often referred to as the sort of higher order skills. What do we want students to do? We don't just want them to remember things. We want them to understand them, but then we want them to apply them. We want them to be able to analyse, evaluate and create. And if we think about those when we're creating our assessments as well, how are we going to create those assessments? If the purpose of doing these learning activities is to get to those higher order skills, how do we build that into assessment? And then on the next 2 diagrams, we've talked about these. I know Peter DeSena talked about them in the first session a little bit. This idea of constructive alignment, thinking about the learning outcomes, what's going on in the classroom, and then how are we going to assess that at the end? And then this idea of backward design, identifying what's the outcome, how are we going to be able to assess that, and then working back into the teaching design from that. So really this is about embedding assessment rather than assessment being an afterthought or only an end product. Now, do we need to rethink assessment in history then? Research suggests that assessment practices are slow to change and thus relatively traditional compared to innovation in other areas of the curriculum. And this is often thought to be a general resistance to changing assessment, but also because of the procedures. It's longer and more time-consuming process to implement changes in assessment than it can be to implement changes in other parts of the curriculum as well. Research suggests, and certainly practice demonstrates, that there are advantages of diversifying assessments and having more authentic assessments. This is particularly around ideas of diversity and inclusivity, thinking about disability, neurodivergence, widening participation, thinking about decolonising the curriculum, thinking about student engagement. During the pandemic as well, there was a lot of changes to assessment and thinking about being flexible and being adaptable. And also the QAA, which we talked about quite a bit in the sessions, has that notion of diversity in assessment being vital. So if we're going to establish, assessment methods to fit for purpose, we need to think not only what we're assessing, not only how are we assessing it, but also thinking a little bit about the rationale for that assessment or assessment type as well, and building that all into the design as well. So on the next slide, we're going to start thinking about types of assessment you've engaged with, that you're familiar with. In your teaching practice, if you're already teaching, or as an observer or a student, if you haven't actually taught yet. And at this stage, we're particularly thinking about what would be called a summative assessment, or the assessments that are graded and contributed to the degree at this point. So I've set up a shared document, which I'll pop into the chat now. And basically we're addressing those things. Firstly, go in there and think about what are the assessments that you're familiar with. Put in bold the ones that you find are most commonly used, either by yourself or by other people. So we can really see which are the commonly used ones. Then which is your preferred type of assessment, briefly why. If you want to put something about why, maybe if it's different, what's the most effective one and why? So there might be some crossover there, obviously, between those two. But then particularly, what would be the sort of on your wish list? What would be the assessment you would like to be able to introduce? if you haven't been able to do so far. So hopefully you've got access to that now. You can go onto that. If you, for any reason, can't access that, just pop that in the chat as well. But hopefully you've got access to the Google Doc.
Hi, Sarah. Yeah, people are, it's being engaged with, definitely.
Thank you. Yes, I can see now lots of ideas going in there. So that's great. Just add in as much as you think. Take time as well. We don't need to rush through this too much as well. Okay, there's some great stuff in there. I'm looking forward to seeing more of the wish list coming out as well as you start to add to that. But already, there's a lot of variety in that first column of type of assessments. Some really interesting things that have been used, not just essays. There's lots of things around role play, book reviews, group projects, group presentations, primary sources, posters, some great things. And yet the ones in bold so far are essays, exams, research papers and individual presentations. So that in itself is really sort of interesting. At this stage, it's thrown me out of my own Google Doc. I'm trying to get back into that now. Jamie, can you see it?
Yes, I can.
Can you see the Google Doc? Could you maybe say some of the things coming out of the other columns, because I can't see it anymore. It's
So
just gone and it won't let me back in.
which one would you like me to do?
So so we've got about the ones they're most commonly used. Could anything about preferred types and why people see them as being a preferred type?
Yeah, research papers allow students to pick a topic, so about student topic, and then apply what they've learned in terms of skills. Presenting, because explaining what you've learned is key to integrating in your head, and it develops public speaking skills. Annotated bibliography allows students to demonstrate that they have engaged with literature and can cite sources, and it's also good feedback for building an essay. So that, again, that's sort of like building, like you said, it's building up, thinking about the stages by which you might produce a piece of work rather than having just one piece at the end, kind of thing. Final essays allow students to research throughout term, use primary sources, use primary sources, and have no element of luck like exams. Continuous assessment, I think somebody's about to write. So do you want me to do most effective assessments?
Yes, there's some most effective and why they think they're the most effective.
Self-evaluation, because it promotes assessment literacy, supports responsive feedback. So it kind of, I guess, embeds the student in the assessment process. Reflection paragraphs allow students to reflect on what they learned and how they can apply it. That's a great idea. I know one of my colleagues does that. Iterated assignments, submit and get feedback at multiple stages, writing and revising something. I was just writing that as you asked me to do this, which was about, I think frequently students like submit the work and then we mark it and then nothing happens to it again, which it doesn't seem very developmental to me. And it kind of encourages them to put things in boxes rather than thinking about how they might see learning as a process and see how different modules connect to one another. Presentations, since they're part of a historian's craft, as it were, and are excellent for summarizing lots of information from primary and secondary sources, and you can get instant feedback. Final essays, again, because they can help students to work throughout the term. So that's it for effective.
What about wish list then?
Wish list, I think this is interesting. So we've got ungrading, ! Assessment without marks, in-class editing, negotiating assessments with students, so making it more of a dialogue rather than the teacher saying this is what the assessment's going to be. And that was me, so I'm biased. Students rewriting work, so that's what I was writing but that's what somebody's just said around that, like revisiting things rather than seeing them as kind of finished. Peer review, students feeding back on other students' work with referencing. Feedback on an essay before a module ends, so they don't just move on to the next module, and that's relating to that idea of seeing it as a continuous process. And again, that replicates academic practice. What we do is we don't write one draft of an essay and then submit it. It goes through multiple iterations. Blog posts, exhibits, etc. Creative ways to communicate information to the public, not just content information, knowledge for information's sake. So thinking about audience, I think, is really important in that one. And also like medium as well. There are different ways in which you can present stuff other than written work or orally. Creative projects challenge students to present their work for different purposes. Great. Podcasts, public history. I'm reading them out live now. Public history projects. So there's some great ideas there on wish lists. And then there's some stuff in other comments. Would you like me to go through that?
I'm just mindful of time, but I will look at that. Go on, a few of them. Go on.
Well, there's 3 people who've written basically the same thing around group work can get a mixed response and can be really difficult, as can presentations. So it requires managing if you're going to try and do it. Many students struggle with exams and essays. They assess a sort of restricted amount of students' ability, like, working under pressure over a short period of time rather than coursework, which gives them more time. So again, it depends what you want students to get out of it. Really, I think peer feedback can be hard because giving quality feedback is a difficult skill. Some colleagues haven't even mastered it, and that is absolutely right. It's very difficult. So again, you need to train students in how to do that, I think. A recent trend in the USA is foundational writing training across disciplines. Would like more of that in the UK. So I guess it's kind of like training students in the basics. And from my perspective, from some of the work I've been doing recently, I would say foundational reading training as well, not just writing. So that's what I've managed to get through.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Jamie.
All right.
And thank you, everyone. I mean, there's some fantastic ideas there. And I think what we've kind of demonstrated, I mean, obviously there's great variation there. You don't all necessarily agree with the preferences and which are the most engaging. They've all got their own advantages and disadvantages. But there's really good reasons for that, because it's about thinking about different people, different staff, different students, the preferences and things that they found engaging, but also different situations. Different types of assessment might not be the best or most appropriate for different situations, which are going to put the student at the heart of it. And I think part of it's being aware of those advantages and disadvantages and how you as the tutor or the students might engage with them or maybe find it challenging. But if you understand the advantages and disadvantages and can then articulate the rationale to your colleagues and to other students, It can be empowering, but it can certainly facilitate more effective assessment practices. And I think it's demonstrated very clearly the importance of that variety and diversity, because the most familiar ones are essays, exams, research papers, whereas the ones everybody's saying we really want to do aren't commonly in place in the curriculum as well, which points to that sort of idea of rethinking the curriculum, which is why I want to talk a little bit now about creative or alternative assessment in history. And I guess there's a question here. The first transition is a question around why creative assist, why do we do this? Thanks, Jamie. Why creative or alternative assessment in history? What's the rationale for it? And I guess there's two parts to that question. Why creative assessment in higher education at all, or alternative assessment, and why in history, a more subject-specific one. And there's also an underpinning concept here around creativity or alternative assessment, which obviously Lucy's talked a lot about here. And we're thinking more about the processes of being creative, problem solving, thinking differently, communicating historical research using non-standard or non-traditional methods, rather than necessarily being a brilliant artist or musician. So there's some the key research behind these creative or alternative assessment points to being learner-centered. It promotes autonomy, can promote self-confidence and reflection in students, and therefore is promoting their student learning in the process. It can also be more inclusive, particularly in thinking about it being an alternative to writing in a discipline that's heavily dominated by the written text, thinking about other ways of communicating knowledge. And it's also can be seen as an authentic assessment, something that's got real life applications in terms of that communication. And as Lucy very interestingly discussed earlier, creativity is an important part of being a historian, even if we don't always think so. So what does this look like in practice then? Well, I've got a couple of case studies and examples from my own practice, one when I was new to teaching and one that I've developed over the last 5 years and still use. So the first is when I was at Sheffield Hallam University, I was relatively new to teaching, I had this fantastic opportunity to redesign a module with a colleague, and we redesigned the assessment. So the assessment became portfolio. It included a public history poster, which was exhibited at a public exhibition, a research essay, and a skills reflection. And there were lots of different stages involved. We didn't just think, we don't just want an exam at the end of this, we'll have a portfolio. We really thought about how we could embed this throughout. So public history was embedded throughout the module, for instance. It was a first year skills-based module with a focus on local history. And we sat down and thought about what's the aim of this module? How could the assessment basically fit this module? And what will we do in the class as a result? And how might that assessment actually facilitate engagement in the classroom as well? So students had a lot of agency in terms of researching their own topic. They could pick any aspect of Sheffield's history, which was interesting to them. And we emphasised how broad that was, because essentially the links between local and global, they could be looking at anything. They undertook original research in archives, local studies libraries, or online databases. They also visited the local studies library and the archives and a range of heritage sites with their tutors. They undertook relevant historiographical research, and the module supported the development of various skills through a lecture programme and workshops. So key concepts and skills could be discussed and developed. Students could work on their projects with support from the tutor. And this included sessions in computer rooms. And then the end product, if you like, that was part of that process was still part of a process, because they put their public history posters on display. This was part of an open event to the public, sometimes held on campus and sometimes at a city centre venue. A local historian was invited to come and judge the posters and award prizes, as well as give us a talk to students and members of the public. So students saw public history in action. They were part of this process, and they were rewarded for that. as well. And they had opportunity to then think about the same research and take it in different directions. So essentially they see that it's the same quality research that's going into this public history poster, this creative output. And it's the same thing that then the actual base of knowledge and understanding is the same knowledge that's coming out from the research essay as well. And then they reflected on that. The second one, it's now University of Nottingham. I introduced a new form of assessment in my second and final year history modules. Students are given the following assessment brief to create a public history or creative output based on original research or interpretation of an aspect of a module. It's intentionally very broad. The concept's clear. They're basically producing a feasible output that communicates complex historical research to a non-academic or a non-specialist audience. And the emphasis is on that being a very desirable and transferable skill. It aims to foster creativity, discovery, and experimentation, to be inclusive, to promote the student voice through co-creation, all of which is underpinned by the pedagogical research, but also supported by feedback from those students. Again, public history and popular representations are key components of the module. There's support in the form of detailed assessments, criteria, guidelines rather, assessment workshops, and one-to-ones. But it was also crucial to emphasise that this was as rigorous and robust as other forms of assessment, both to get it through the validation process for other colleagues, but also to students as well, so they could understand not only what this assessment was and what was required of students, but also how it related to other forms of assessment as well and what that meant in practice. So, and it was also important to think about what value this was adding as well. So it's not just for the sake of it. So on the next slide, I've got a couple of examples and a list of some of the examples as well, because they've been so varied. They always inspire me. They always excite me. These are fantastic outputs from exhibits, educational resources, board games, podcasts, documentaries. Some might do artworks or dance, very creative things. Somebody did a 3-song album, concept album on life in the countryside this year. And it was just so inspired because they'd taken ideas about not just public history, but how people communicated about life in the countryside in the 19th century and put that across. And the feedback from students and colleagues has shown what it's brought out. It's encouraging them to think differently. It enriched their learning. It was more challenging, but worth it. It's allowed me to develop deeper understanding. They found it stimulating. Now, obviously, there are challenges and obstacles, and there's a lot more I could say about this, and I'll be talking about this at other events later in the year, which I'll mention at the end of the session, if you're interested in finding out more. But part of this links to that last quote, that transforming assessment, whether it's going to be introducing whole new types of assessment or just transforming the idea of assessment, is a process that requires wide-ranging stakeholder engagement. I had an idea, I had to engage my colleagues, I had to pitch that, I had to create a process to get to validation of that assessment. I involve the students, I constantly think about revising it in response to what students are saying. And I encourage other colleagues to think about the assessment. They might just go back to their essays in the end, because they're very valid methods of assessment in history, but encouraging people to talk about it. Now, so far, we've really sort of thought about assessment almost as an end product, but a process that's involved with that. I think it would be useful for us to bring together a lot of what's been talked about in these sessions to broaden our definition of assessment and think about ourselves all as stakeholders in transforming assessment. So on the next slide, we're going to think about designing assessment activities and our agency in assessment. Assessment isn't all about that formal or summative assessment. It could be about developing historical skills. It could be assessing whether or not students have understood things and can apply them. And it really does link back to that first session by Peter de Sena yesterday about bottlenecks. So whatever autonomy you have and whatever career stage you're at, there are opportunities to design assessment activities It can be used in the classroom, even if you can't design the ones that are going to be graded. And there are opportunities to maximise the effectiveness or potential of that assessment, even if you've had no oversight over the design of that assessment either. So this is sort of intimated on this table as an idea to reflect on at a later stage. That whether you're the seminar tutor, and that's your role, you've had no autonomy or control over the actual module content or the assessment, whether you're a module leader and convener, and whether you're actually course leader or director of teaching and learning, and you might actually be coordinating program level assessment. Whatever level it is, there are opportunities for you to be involved, but there are things you should be thinking about all the way through. And again, the other list is not exhaustive, but it might be thinking about aligning it to the teaching activities and module aims. It might be thinking about putting the student at the heart of the assessment. It might be about things around inclusivity. It might just be simply about the purpose of it, and certainly should take on board things around scaffolding and support and how we sort of see assessment as a process rather than a finished product as well. And part of that process is thinking about developing students' assessment literacy, which is on the next slide. So this refers to an understanding of assessment concepts and procedures. It's about the capability to make a sense of those assessments, and then with that understanding, exercise control over the assessment and the teaching and learning process. And that applies as much to sort of staff and students developing that assessment literacy, but recognising that there are obviously going to be differences between the student and the staff in terms of what we might think is straightforward, what we think is you know, what's a good argument look like? What do those things look like in practice? And then developing that. So sometimes it's around the language, sometimes it's around that constructive alignment, sometimes it's around things like the assessment criteria and standards and policies, things around reliability and validity. It can be fostered by many ways though, in many different ways. So formative assessment, peer and self-assessment, micro-assessments, simply articulating and deconstructing the assessment criteria can be very important as part of that process, making the assessment and feedback processes very transparent. And it requires, you know, effective feedback, which we'll briefly talk about. It can stimulate deeper learning as well. And I think the most important thing there is it's about developing this shared understanding of the assessment as a process and as a dialogue as well, something that's ongoing that we can talk about. So I'm briefly just going to talk about feedback. Quite briefly, I focus more on the assessment. I'm certainly not talking about marking, but we do need to think about effective feedback and what does that look like. We'll all have at different universities criteria: poor, good, very good, excellent. What does that actually look like in practice? What do we mean by that? What does the student mean by that? Do they understand, you know, you're saying, well, this is quite this is an excellent argument, this is a poor argument. Do students understand that? How does that vary between an essay and a creative output as well? Having effective criteria so that the feedback relates to criteria that students can then understand and apply. It should also be developmental. The assessment should be about a process and developmental, and therefore we might want to think more about feeding forward, it going into something. So it being constructive, instructive, motivational even, supportive. It needs to be accurate and objective, but it also needs to be transparent and sensitive. It needs to be specific and perhaps there's sufficient comment on both the strengths and the areas for development and the strategies for improvement. Feedback needs to be manageable. The length of feedback is something often people want to ask questions around, and less can be more in some respects. There will be probably guidelines on that in your department or faculty, but less can be more because it's got to be digestible and you can apply that. It needs to be timely, and again there'll be guidelines on that, but this is less about saying you should give the feedback in 10 days time or something, but thinking about formative feedback in the classroom. That can be really important in terms of the process. It can be part of a discussion, it can be comments on essay plans, And it's part of that assessment for learning or as learning. But also, if you are under a lot of pressure and there's lots of essays to mark and there might have been a delay that's legitimate and you can do that, then there's a big question about collective feedback. You've got those essays to mark, but you've always already got an impression of where work is strong and where it needs developing across the cohort. And you could discuss that as a whole group discussion as well. And then think about how we respond to feedback and how we receive it and act on that feedback. We want honesty. We want to know how we can improve our work, but we don't necessarily want that notorious so-called reviewer 2 criticism that just rips our work apart. We need to see feedback as being a process and a dialogue that engages with students all the way through. And therefore, you can maximize the potential of that assessment by ensuring students are part of that process of the feedback. It's not just something, again, that they receive and it's an end product. There's a process going on. Okay, so we're coming to an end now, but I just would like to encourage you to sort of reflect or even plan. Think about everything we've been talking about over the 2 days, but particularly in terms of assessment. Is there an assessment activity you could feasibly introduce, whether that's just in the classroom or to a module, and think about how it might fit your specific role at the moment, or the specific practice or specific purpose? Or how might you put some of the 2 days discussions, and then specifically the today's discussions about assessment and feedback, into practice or into action, and the things that you might actively now do as a result of this? If you just want to add some comments in the chat before we go across to some questions, opportunity for questions as well. So what are the sort of the tangible take homes that you might do around assessment? I guess that could be, you know, you've got the whole opportunity to redesign the module and redesign the assessment, but it could just be activities that you want to do in the classroom as well. Any thoughts in the chat? Okay, we've got one here. Make sure students know when they're being assessed versus when they're being given feedback. Do not make it all grade-based. I think that's so important. You know, the whole sort of culture around grading and students wanting a grade and wanting to know that it's not all grade-based is so important, and a great thing to take forward, and something that I think we could all do in our practice as well. I guess we go to the last slide, Jamie. I'd love to hear what anybody else is thinking about they might put into practice, or what they could feasibly introduce. But also, if we want to go to the last slide, I can just briefly mention, if you're interested in assessment more broadly, including creative assessment, but including sort of the future of exams, thinking about different types of assessment. There's a big History UK event on assessment in history taking place on the 8th of October 2022. I can put the link in the chat to that event as well. And if you're interested in signing up on that, there's all sorts of discussions going on around assessment in history specifically as well. And of course, I see somebody's put short paragraph on the reading, and then you can hand it back to them in the next lesson with comments in the margin for them to develop. Yeah, all about those incremental developmental processes. There's all things we can do on a day-to-day basis in our teaching, which is part of our assessment and feedback process that students will then be able to apply as they go on. Okay, thank you, everyone. And if anyone's got any questions, please do ask.
Um, I'm just going to stop screen sharing, but thanks so much, Sarah. That was really interesting. I think there were so many good ideas that people had in the Google Doc that I think we could just copy across into the chat. There are many that I thought I would like to review and possibly try and experiment with. And I think that live editing, that's really interesting. That's something that has really been going on in several of the presentations today, where people have been getting feedback as they've been going and giving feedback as they've been going. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. And I think it, like Gavern has just said, I think it really actually linked back quite nicely to what Peter had to say right at the start about helping students through the process and seeing this all as a process rather than a kind of as a transaction with an end point is really important. And I think nearly everybody in their own different ways has talked about that. So it's been a long 2 days, and I'd like to thank everybody who's presented. I'd like to thank everybody who's stuck with us through the 2 days. I'd like to thank the Royal Historical Society and History UK again for all of their support. And yeah, we will be sending around some a feedback form in due course that will probably come quite soon, and then the resources will be posted and you'll be made aware of their availability in probably within the next month. It might take a little bit of time for us to process them all, particularly the videos. If anybody has any immediate comments, then please do feel free to drop me a line specifically, and I'm hopefully we'll be doing a similar version of this next year. The idea as well is to do 1 or 2 events during the year that are much shorter, but that focus on specific themes that will be of interest to people who are new to teaching, but also people who've been teaching for a bit longer.